Hopefully I haven't held things up too much, because I rehearsed this yesterday, and I've only got about half an hour of materials, so shouldn't delay things too much. But what I'm going to say is kind of taken from a book that is upcoming, so I'm going to pop that in the chat if people can have a look at the blurb. And I guess I also wanted to share with people the actual, this is a corrected proof, if people want to check that out. And, you know, if you're curious about what I've got to say, then please feel free to follow up. But this is a kind of edited version of some of the things that I'm saying there. So to get straight into it, one of my arguments in the book is that Western philosophers have tended only to be interested in history insofar as it was inspirational or exemplified universal truths of some kind. And I argue in the book that classical and Christian thought have tended to reinforce one another here, and the prejudice has really lingered. So even when we take modern philosophers who are historically minded, like Kant and Hegel, they really only cared about history insofar as it reveals a divine plan accessible to reason. Now, I do think there is a rationalist version of history in the form of modern social science that is still helpful to us. But the inspirational variety of history has become the source of, I think, a great deal of harm in the modern world, and that's what needs to be given up. I also think these inspirational types of historical narratives remain much more influential than is commonly recognized. So there was a point in the late 20th century when it seemed possible to declare that what Jean-François Lyotard called metanarratives, or overarching interpretations of history that attributed a single goal to the historical process, had become obsolete. And what Lyotard was responding to was the failure of 20th century totalitarian programs on both left and right. So fascism and National Socialism had ended in disastrous warfare in the mid-century. And also by the 1970s, it was clear that Soviet communism was similarly morally and intellectually bankrupt. Now, all three of these ideologies had relied significantly for their legitimation on stories about the past. Fascism was going to recreate the glories of Roman and Renaissance Italy, and hence Mussolini's goal of founding a third Rome. Actually, as I'm sure you all know, this claim had already been advanced in Moscow centuries earlier, when Ivan III was held up by his subjects as the rightful heir to Byzantium, and we shall come back to this. And of course, Hitler wanted to establish a racially based Third Reich, which would be the historical successor to the medieval Holy Roman Empire and the 19th century German Empire. So communism might seem like the odd one out here because it tried to present itself as a decisive break with the past. But then I would say that precisely by doing so, it remained deeply implicated with it. So Karl Marx presents communism as the necessary outcome of a long history of class struggle. And that's the true meaning of all previous history. So communism doesn't really break with this tendency to tell kind of inspirational historical stories. But Lyotard is saying that by the 1970s, these kinds of stories have lost their power. But I think that Lyotard has turned out to be premature. So remember Francis Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history at the end of the Cold War. I think this really shows the power of meta-narratives remained intact. And Fukuyama's argument revived Hegel's theory that the history of the West, and by extension, the history of the whole world, was the story of freedom. With the collapse of Soviet communism, the victory of liberal democracy was supposedly complete. To be fair to Fukuyama, who's often criticized today for having been naively optimistic about the end of the Cold War, he thought of this victory as a moral and intellectual one, but he was clear that the end of history did not signal the end of major events. Indeed, I think we should give Fukuyama credit in hindsight for this sentence written in 1989. Ultranationalists in the USSR believe in their Slavophile cause passionately, and one gets the sense that the fascist alternative is not one that has played itself out entirely there. So what Fukuyama meant, that's the democratic way of life. He was saying that Hegel was right in the sense that once you have recognized everyone, whether male or female, or whatever race or nationality, as a free individual of equal status to all other persons, there's nowhere left to go, logically speaking. You can only start taking freedoms away from people again. All that is possible is a kind of regression. So Hegel may have been wrong to think that the West had arrived at this outcome as a result of a dialectically necessary process, but he wasn't wrong about the outcome itself. As Charles Taylor has argued, as the outcome of its history, the West really does feel particularly strongly the demand for universal justice and beneficence, is particularly sensitive to the claims of equality, and feels the demands to freedom and self-rule as axiomatically justified. Still, the problem for both Fukuyama and Hegel, even if their diagnosis is correct, is that they present a view of history that's not been reached in the first instance purely by historical study. Hegel's view that history was a dialectically necessary process was not a conclusion that followed from any historical investigation. It was a philosophical belief that he imposed on the historical process from outside, as it were. And in that respect, even if we like the Hegel-Fukuyama story, because we approve of freedom and equality, we must recognize that it's a story of the same kind as the fascist and communist stories. Treating history as the story of freedom is no different in this respect from treating it as the story of racial or class struggle, because all of these narratives involve imposing a story on history that's not actually derived from historical inquiry, but is arrived at by other means. So far from inspirational historical meta-narratives of this kind being obsolete, I believe that they are actually alive and well. And the kind of fascistic Slavic nationalism that Fukuyama noted was still a force in Russia in the 1990s has since been used, of course, to justify the invasion of Ukraine. An apologist for Vladimir Putin's regime like Alexander Dugin has put Martin Heidegger's concept of Dasein at the center of his philosophy. Now, I don't want to dismiss Heidegger's philosophy in all respects, but it's nonetheless the case that Heidegger's concept of Dasein is bound up with a philosophy of history that's very much in the Hegelian tradition. The only difference is that where Hegel sees progress and reconciliation, Heidegger sees decline and conflict. And the history of being, according to Heidegger, was the covering up of its meaning in a way that had become increasingly disastrous in modernity, thanks to technological rationalism. Now, Dugin takes this story and applies it to the Russian context, so that it becomes a justification for a Eurasian movement that's hostile to what it alleges is Western unipolarity. The Eurasian mission, according to Dugin, is to escape the corruption of the West and restore the authentic Dasein of Slavic civilization. So writing in 2004, Dugin declared that Ukraine, whether it likes it or not, and it's now very clear it doesn't like it at all, was to be included in this movement, with its elections monitored by Russian representatives of Eurasianism. He regarded Ukraine's inclusion as vital in order to guarantee the stability of the Eurasian Union that Dugin envisaged. So according to Dugin, the western boundary of Eurasian civilization is somewhat east of the western border of Ukraine, making this new state of Ukraine fragile and unsustainable. Now, this view, of course, relies on the idea that there really is such a thing as Eurasian civilization in some fixed and essential sense of the term. So Dugin is relying on nationalism as well as Heideggerianism. And this concept of the national civilizational unit is really a creation of the 18th century. Kant's critic and student, Johann Herder, is one of its important progenitors. But again, like the Hegelian theory, nationalism is not really the product of historical analysis. The nationalist view was the product of a need rather to put political authority on a new basis. So in the early modern and Enlightenment era, the old normative classical Christian cosmology was losing its appeal. The reasons, of course, were complex. They included the rise of modern science and technology, the discovery of the Americas, the split in Christianity that generated the Catholic-Protestant divide, the changing socio-economic order which challenged aristocratic as well as ecclesiastical authority, and so on. No doubt much else. But in response, nationalism gave individuals an identity rooted in language, history, and culture that could offer a sense of solidarity and belonging in a changed world. However, it was an identity that was really essentially mythological. It centered on historical events and figures that could be represented as inspirational, not on the facts. The aim in the end is really to make us feel good about ourselves, which tends to encourage us to be unquestioning and uncritical, complacent. Think, for example, of the case of popular education in American history, which tends to gloss over the fact that their founding fathers, like Washington and Jefferson, who established a republican constitution dedicated to individual liberty, were also slave owners. So there's a tension here that we still face with respect to the problem of how to educate the citizens of modern states. On the one hand, we want them to be able to feel proud of their country and their culture. On the other hand, as David Hume pointed out long ago, almost all the governments which exist at present, or of which there remains any record in history, have been founded originally either on usurpation or conquest. No one comes out of an honest narrative of history looking particularly great. And this is a real dilemma. And to explore it further, I'd like now to turn to the deeper background of our contemporary thought about history. So this is going back to the book on categories, where I start with Plato, because in this, as in so much else, he became a kind of paradigm case. It's true that Plato doesn't strictly have a theory of categories. It was Aristotle who first used the term in a philosophical sense. But Aristotle did so as part of his critique of Plato. Aristotle's theory of categories is a direct response to Plato's theory of forms. So treating the forms as, in effect, categories in the general sense of basic or fundamental concepts has been regarded by Plato scholars like Gregory Vlastos as a legitimate way of understanding them. So I'm following people like Vlastos here and hopefully not doing too much violence to Plato. Now, the exact nature of the forms in Plato is, of course, highly contentious. But he does seem to have considered them to have a universal quality. All instances of justice in the world of appearances we inhabit, for example, are exemplars of the form of justice. Somehow, a just action or a just person reproduces the quality of the form via a relation that Plato calls participation. Now, we're not interested in the validity of this theory here. but in the way in which it functions in Plato's thought, because Plato goes on to make knowledge of the forms the most important kind of human understanding, more important even than mathematics, and certainly much more important than any kind of technical or practical knowledge. It's mastery of this knowledge which legitimates the title of the philosopher rulers to govern in his ideal society described in the Republic, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So, in Plato's legitimation of authority, knowledge of history plays no formal role, even though history was emerging as a distinct genre of writing in Athens at the time. And so as a result, it's sometimes said Plato had no real interest in history, but I think this goes a bit too far. It is true, history is not required for the education of the philosopher ruler, but Plato does still think history is important in two ways. And the first is as exemplary. So in the Republic, Plato presents a theory of history, if you like, as a cyclical process in which decline from the ideal is inevitable. Even the philosopher ruler, in the end, can't prevent this. Government for Plato is always a rearguard action. You are continuously fighting on the retreat in order to delay the inevitable defeat that's going to follow. But it is at least possible to state in a predictable way what the successive forms of government will be as we pass from the ideal to oligarchy to democracy and finally to tyranny. And here perhaps we can see in Plato the distant origins of the modern social scientific point of view. We're seeking a generic or a typical series of events, which importantly has some predictive use. And this remains the kind of view of history in a social scientific sense that does have value for us. But the second way in which Plato is interested in history is with respect to the foundings of states, as with the story of Atlantis. So in another dialogue, Critias, Plato wants to provide Athens with a kind of heroic genealogy, and he does so by telling a mythical story of a war with the city of Atlantis that took place thousands of years earlier. Plato tries to give the tale the trappings of authenticity by associating it with manuscripts of Greek translations made by the Athenian lawgiver Solon from Egyptian texts, which indicates that Plato was well aware that genuine history needed to be based on sources. But of course, Plato's own account of Atlantis is, to the best of our knowledge, pure invention. Its point was to be inspirational, not true. And it's this side of the Platonic legacy which is particularly problematic. What Plato, of course, wasn't interested in was history that was neither inspirational nor exemplary, but offered only an understanding of a series of events in terms of what Charles Taylor calls the singular causal judgment. In other words, he wasn't interested in narrative history at all, in the sense of the history that historians write today as historiography. And this isn't because, let me repeat, this kind of history wasn't being written in Plato's time. It was. People like Thucydides were writing what we still consider history in the modern sense at that time. But Plato was only concerned with the past insofar as it could serve the needs of the present or the future. An analysis of past events that didn't help to legitimate authority or calibrate future expectations, but only addressed the truth of the past, was philosophically uninteresting to him. And despite Aristotle's significant differences from Plato on a number of points, he shared this view. Hence Aristotle's famous remark, poetry is more philosophical than history because it's more universal. History, as simple succession, one thing after another, was no fit subject for metaphysics, so far as Aristotle was concerned. And this prejudice, I think, is very much reinforced in medieval thought, from a very different perspective, by Christianity. History was important for Christianity insofar as it was a story of a fall and then an ultimate redemption. Of course, this is also true of Jewish and Islamic thought in various ways. It's common to all three versions of monotheism. What was important in past events was whatever related to the realization of the divine plan, which was, of course, in its own way, a universally applicable scheme. No human being was exempt from its operations. But it was possible to combine the ancient metaphysical tradition with this Christian scheme insofar as it was thought possible to figure out the workings of this plan using rational methods. And this is where modern philosophers like Kant and Hegel come back into picture. So this is why I argue it's a great mistake to treat thinkers like Kant and Hegel as presenting us with secular theories of progress. Kant and Hegel are both explicitly Christian thinkers, or at least theistic, in the way that they make their arguments. So, of course, after Hegel, we do get ostensibly purely secular theories of the historical process, although, of course, it's often said of Marxism, for example, but it reproduces the logic of the earlier views of history and thus continue to function in a quasi-religious way. And indeed, without the kind of inspirational and predictive aspects of Marx's theory of history, it seems plausible that it would not have been nearly as influential as it actually turned out to be. It was a vision of the whole of humanity finally being liberated from oppression as the necessary future outcome of the workings of the historical process that proved so attractive to so many of Marx's followers. And although liberalism was in many ways hostile to revolutionary Marxism, liberalism too relied on a belief that history was necessarily progressive and emancipatory. The modern notion of human rights has often been sustained by just these sorts of assumptions, often traceable back to Kant in particular. It bears repeating, however, that none of these theories of history have been derived from the critical analytical study of history. And not only that, I would argue they are underivable from it. It's impossible from the study of an individual series of events that in its very nature cannot happen twice to arrive at necessary laws of historical development. Another way to put the point is to insist that there is no learning from history. It has no lessons for us in this sense. The past is unrepeatable and the future is unpredictable. Studying what's happened before is no guide to what's going to come next. Now, what can be done is to predict what kinds of things will come next. The French Revolution will not repeat itself, but there may be more revolutions. The Napoleonic Wars will never happen again, but there will probably, sadly, be more wars. This predictive approach, however, relies on a generic approach to events. We have to treat events as instances of universals. And this is very important work when done well. I would point to the social scientist Peter Turchin, for example, who has shown in books like Ages of Discord what kinds of variables tend to increase political instability and should therefore lead us to expect possible societal breakdowns and crises in future. Some of Turchin's answers are pretty obvious. Increases in economic inequality tend to be destabilizing when they become too extreme. I think that's fairly intuitive. But he identifies some less obvious factors that should also give us cause to worry. For example, Turchin fixes on the idea of what he calls elite overproduction. Too many people competing for too few key positions in government, business, and the professions is also an indicator of likely turmoil, as the losers become disaffected and turn themselves into focal points for discontent amongst the wider population. So this is the kind of thing that social scientists do, even though they're not historians. And it is very helpful for us, this kind of social scientific approach to historical analysis. But then what's the use of history, actually? So I would argue that history in the strict historiographical sense, the kind of thing that goes on in university history departments, has a very important negative sensorial role to play in public life and in politics. So that historians can, if you will excuse my language, call bullshit on the kinds of narratives advanced by self-serving philosophers and political leaders who are peddling mythological tales about racial destiny. In the English-speaking world, This is exactly what historians have done when there have been attempts to deny the reality of the extermination camps under Hitler, for example. So self-styled historians like David Irving have lost in court when they've tried to deny the historical evidence of German crimes during the Second World War, because historians like Richard Evans have turned up and said, no, actually, this is really what the record indicates happened. Of course, in the Russian context, in our own time, historians of Russia like Stephen Kotkin are doing the same thing with regard to the religious and ethno-nationalist narratives that are legitimating the current conflict. Unfortunately, these interventions by historians lack the kinetic force of bombs and bullets, and they won't roll back any invaders. But for the longer term, I still think they are very important for humanity at large, indeed, which needs to wean itself off the tendency to mythologize the past. And this is much easier said than done, of course. No nation is immune to the temptation to present itself in the best possible light. Trying to overcome this tendency requires careful attention to the terms and conditions of historical education, including, for example, things like school textbooks. There is no country in the world that I know of, and the little bit of knowledge I have of Ukraine suggests this is true of Ukraine. History textbooks are not controversial. But textbooks that try to at least tell the truth about the past and make clear where the disagreements are require a commitment to learning history more honestly. And this is something everybody needs to work on. Britain, the USA, Ukraine, I don't care, Russia, everywhere. So what I've tried to argue is this involves a reconsideration of the kind of history that we learn. For powerful religious and philosophical reasons, I've argued that the dominant forms of history in Western thought have been exemplary and inspirational. I've also argued there's a modern rationalist version of exemplary history in the form of the social scientific study of the past, which is in fact very valuable. But it's valuable precisely because it doesn't try to be inspirational. The inspirational version of history, on the other hand, is what underlies both totalitarian, fascist, and liberal progressive versions of the historical process. And this, I think, is what has to be given up. And that we can give it up, I think, is proven to at least some extent by the success of historians in the last century or so of arriving at a narrative of world history of a kind that didn't exist even in the later 1800s. We have a sense of what is happening when all around the world and how human history gradually becomes interconnected over the course of the last couple of thousand years, that people in the 18th, even in the 19th century, just did not have. And this is the product of work by anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, and others. And this is, in its own way, a kind of enlightenment that we enjoy that earlier human beings did not. But that knowledge and that consensus around the narrative of world history has yet to really migrate from historiography to the classroom. As James Lurven has pointed out in a book with a great title, Lies My Teacher Told Me, the research that's available in the academy often fails to be transmitted rapidly enough, or indeed at all, to the school textbook. And textbooks thus end up contributing to, rather than undermining, narcissistic national self-mythologizing. And Lurven's making a point in the context of the USA, but as I say, I think we are all guilty of this to a greater or lesser extent. But the beginning of the solution is simply, I think, in recognizing that there's a problem with historical education. Finally, it may be worth underlining that insofar as what we're demanding are more honest representations of the past, which don't rely on notions like a heroic racial destiny, This goal is not really in conflict with finding events and people in the past to admire. Greatness is not the same thing as perfection. We will give future generations a better, more interesting version of history if we give them, so far as possible, histories populated by real human beings who are great in some ways but very flawed in others. And by telling the story of real events that don't gloss over the awfulness of history in favor exclusively of what seem to us to be its highlights, or try to use history to justify forcibly imposing one culture on another. Thank you very much, and apologies again for my lateness, purely a time zone confusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your interesting and very inspiring presentation. Really, today we have a significant seminar. Why? We have crossed the borders of Europe and United States of America. Now, as a territory, Asia is joined us. Our speaker represents the National University of Singapore, and I hope they will maybe embrace all of our with at the during of our dialogues. If any questions, any comments, let's start our dialogue. And first of all, I would like to thank you very much that you presented us full text of your book. It's really great present, great gift for us that we can use it. Really, I would like to ask you and to comment later. And as I am graduated historical faculty of Odessa National University, and after that I became like some philosophers, but it's my historical roots, and today our faculty again combined in Odessa University. Before that it was philosophical faculty and historical. Now we have to join, and now it's a faculty of history and philosophy again. It's my alma mater, it's my motherland in my university. And as for me, it's the most important topic in the philosophy and in the humanities, this synthesis between philosophy and history. And after that, I would like to discuss with you some problematic events and discussion that arose yesterday at the time of our discussion of the syllabus of the Department of the History of Ukraine. History of Ukraine as a teaching subject is obligatory for all specialities in university, and all students of not only universities but any classical university and technological university. Maybe Elena can add something. Do you have this subject as obligatory in mandatory in your university in Kryvyi Rih?
Yes, I think
Yes.
students of all faculties study history.
Have to study this. And I have to start from the some discussive point for me. And I'm glad that you arise this question. And from this point of view, it's a questions. All students studied history of Ukraine at the time of their school secondary education. After that, they entered in the university and will start again to study same subject. And my colleagues really, I have our faculty of history, our colleagues, historians in Odessa are very good, very famous, and they have some scientific degrees and many results of their productive scientific activity. And it's very interesting to follow for their discussion about such methods of education. And as for me, it was really, they wanted to change this repetition of the secondary school course of history and to add something new, more theoretical, and how to create the such name it quality of the historical process, quality of the history of Ukraine, especially in our time when we have to change our historical narratives. And what was this so, I'm not agree radically when one of the colleagues said, for example, it's not, it's a theoretical point, not something worldview or something else. Today we extremely change some, not narratives, so to basic points of the description of the history. For example, on the level of the school education in discussion, historians, Ukrainian historians refused from the title Kiev, Russia, Kiev, Russia, Kievskaya Rus, Kievskaya Rus, так сказать, Kiev Rus. I don't know how to tell exactly. New titles came to us, Русь, Украина, так? Русь, Украина.
Ukraine.
Yeah, how to tell it? Can you help me to change, to correct this? And it's okay, but this line that history education in the university have to follow for the some ideas, methodological position of the author of school, secondary school textbook. And really, my colleagues came to conclusion that we stop any discussion about such fundamental position, and we have to follow for the. I understand that why it happened today. I understand from point of view of our position at the time of the war, at the time of the war with Russia, but its situation today, but as a line for the future development of the historical education, as for me, it's strange way that we have to follow for the school textbook and in the university refuse for any discussion about fundamental position. What's one? Yesterday I didn't talk about with my colleagues. It was very interesting for me. Just now I belong to philosophy faculty. I only listen at the discussion, and only here I came to ask you, what do you think? What about these fundamental questions in the historical education? Categories, yes, on something. As for me, this primary level of historical education come to be some how to model for the historical education in the universities and also. And my second point for discussion, it's such named basic categories of history. Basic categories of history. But for example, what is your maybe version of the most basic categories of history? This question closely connected with the one version of the philosophy of the culture that was elaborated by famous famous philosopher from Odessa, Professor Alexander Kirilluk. He proposed structuralistic and semiotic description universals of culture. such as basic categories of the culture. Now, for example, in his version, death, birth, mortality, immortality, for example, what basic structure of the culture. And combination of these 4 categories can describe all universe of the culture. Do you see some heuristic effect in the elaboration of such kind of categories? And in this, I can follow my my thought. I understand that we can describe categories, first of all, as a narrative, historiographical production, or categories as a substantial in the such vulgarized version of Hegel. They exist, or Plato, aideses, yes. I understand that we can divide 2 type of the analysis, but in this case too, what is your idea about the most universal categories of history today?
Right.
From your view, and my thought question too. Thought, and as a teacher, as who I am many years work with the students, and from year to year, I am and my colleagues followed for the such named appearance of ahistorical consciousness, not not non-historical, ahistorical, but maybe disappearance of the historical view. For example, historical narrative in the style of Plutarch, where history and biography are very closely connected, and history plus biography of heroes led to the rising of morality in the society, led to creation of a form of lives. But just now we follow for such tendency. No, maybe it's my initiative to your dialogue. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot there to respond to. The first point on schools and universities and philosophy and history, I do think at university, you do want to try and give students more of a sense of the philosophical problems that come up from trying to learn about the past. How do we know? Because we can't observe the past. This is one of those things that we cannot go and look. So the study of history immediately makes any naive empiricism very problematic. We cannot just go and see the thing that we're talking about. That there's a debate whether the past is real. Philosophers argue over the metaphysics of the past. Is the past real in some way? Even if it is real, it's completely unobservable. We can't see it. So we have to come at the past indirectly by evidence, source criticism, basically. And this is the kind of thing where at school you don't really raise these problems so much. At school, you have to kind of give the kids a fairly fixed story, at least until they are maybe 16, 17, 18 years old, and then you can start to touch on these problems. But when you have history students at university, it's important that they start to understand the process by which historical knowledge gets produced and the debates that involves, because historical knowledge progresses via argument. you need a sense of the way in which historians argue with one another, and that's how we gradually improve our knowledge, by having these kind of debates and questions about interpretation and so on. So there's that meta level, that epistemological level of discussion, which raises very important philosophical questions, and that's where at the university level I think philosophy and history do come together in a productive way, which is hard to do at school, where you have to treat it as much more kind of fact-based, and you can't get quite so much into the philosophical questions. What you can do at school, I think what you should try and do, is engage the imagination of students so that they appreciate how things were very different in the past. Because I think we tend to take the world around us for granted. As a kid, you kind of think it's always been this way. And I think this touches on your third point about erasure and the disappearance of the historical view and ahistorical consciousness. I think modernity is particularly bad for encouraging an ahistorical outlook, because modernity has a kind of inbuilt sort of progressive assumption where the future is just going to get better, and therefore why do we need to care about the past? This is in a sense the downside of the Enlightenment view, that everything before modernity is the Dark Ages, so we don't need to care about it. But in fact, even if it was the Dark Ages, it made us who we are. So the present is necessarily the outcome of the past. If you treat the present in an ahistorical way, you're missing a very important feature of your identity. So I think at school level, by engaging kids' imagination and by showing them a lot of pictures, you can make history in schools a lot more picture-based and a lot more object-based, showing them things from the past, old photos, old paintings, old objects, old clothes, stuff people used to wear they don't wear anymore. You can make kids aware that the past is very different. And I think that sense of historical difference is something that at least you can give kids at school level. And then at university level, you can engage more with problems of source criticism and interpretation and so on. So the final thing you mentioned, basic categories of history. How you want to answer this question depends on whether we're talking about history, the process, or history, the kind of form of knowledge, because you're going to get very different answers depending whether I suppose this is an epistemological or, if you like, an ontological question. If you're talking about history as a way of thinking about things, it was on the end of the basic category of history as a science is change. I like Peter Muntz I'll put that in the chat, but Peter Muntz has this Shapes of History, it's called. I'll put that in the chat. I was just reading this, and Muntz calls history the science of change. That's what history fundamentally is. So your basic category as a historian is that you're explaining change. But if you're talking about the historical process and culture, then of course you're looking for, I guess, something more social scientific, where you might be talking about what's the basic unit of historical development. So can we talk about the nation state? Can we talk about civilizations at a larger scale, Western civilization versus Chinese civilization, or something like this? So the basic categories in that sense are much more sociological / cultural. They can change. I mean, you get in the ancient world, in ancient Western culture, you have something like the Greek polis. It doesn't exist anymore. So these basic units or basic historical categories when we're dealing with history as a process, I think these are not fixed or not very fixed. I mean, you can talk in very general terms. There are wars, there are revolutions, but again, modern war is really not very much like ancient war at all in terms of how it's fought, how it's conducted, and so on. So you can talk about basic categories of historical knowledge in the sociological sense with regard to history as a process, but they tend to be pretty general and themselves open to change. What I'm trying to do in the book is maybe say a bit more about the first sense, historical categories that are involved in the way we come to know history. So it's a bit more of an epistemological sort of set of categories that I'm interested in the book, I guess. Does that help? Have I answered your question at all?
It's only starting point for investigation of this great problem, and very, very interesting. Please, who can learn?
Ellen.
And Paul. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ellen. Really nice to see you.
Very nice. And I would like to again and again, many thanks, Alena Mishalova. She was initiative of this meeting, and today we are together with Luke David O'Sullivan. Thank you, Olena.
Thank you for the good words, and I'm happy we organized this meeting, and it's very late for Luke, I understand, and that's why thank you very much a lot. And following previous questions, I would like to add another one. I see another big problem with our master narratives. I absolutely agree with you that big master historical narratives, not only historical, religious narratives, philosophical master narratives, they don't disappear. They still very effective. And especially in the sphere of national history, I mean national historical narratives, master historical narratives, and taking into account how history is maybe from another side. Our school history courses and our national narratives are still organized around political history. And our world history, in fact, is reduced to political history. And as Karl Popper said, that in such case, all history reduced to the mass murders and crimes against humanity, because as a rule, political history is about wars, is about building great empires, and so on and so forth. And there is another big question: how our national master narratives should be organized in the 21st century. And in my opinion, the most fruitful framework, narrative of cultural convergency, can propose to us, because in the center we can put culture issues and cultural convergency as cultural collaboration, influences of all groups, ethnics, religious, gender groups, and I understand that this is possible only under one conditions: if our politicians can agree with this, because it depends very much on their decisions. And how do you think about narrative of cultural convergence? And my second question about narrative, but narrative in the epistemological sense. How do you think? Maybe it makes sense to reconsider the concept of historical narrative. I mean, historical narrative as a separate, particular historical work, not as master narrative, as big or as large conceptual scheme, And my question, I think it would be interesting to consider the narrative as a form of organization and representation of historical knowledge, specific for history, namely for history. And just as historic fact differs from scientific fact, because historical facts are always about unique, singular events. And just in the same way, historical narrative differs from theory in science. And historical narrative focuses on presenting, on explaining particular, as you said, unrepeatable events and processes. And this is maybe a reason why sometimes we need several narratives to explain some historical phenomena instead to have one theory in science to explain some phenomena in biology, for example, and so on. Because for science, one theory can be enough to explain something. For history, I think one narrative is never enough to explain. And what do you think about this second understanding, epistemological understanding of narrative, about idea to reconsider, reconsider the notion of narrative, because as a rule, narrative is considered in the sense of Arthur Danto as a scheme for explaining, for describing big changes, but it's not always so, I think.
Okay, thank you. Two very interesting questions. Yes, the continuing dominance of political history in organizing certainly master narratives is very problematic. You know, I have just, as I was indicating, absolutely no time for the kind of racist Slavophile nonsense that Dugin is spouting. But let's assume that we're not talking about that. Let's just talk about, as it were, history in the scholarly sense, or even the kind of textbook sense, where the kind of narratives we want to give school children, university students. Certainly, it's bad when political history crowds out the other stuff. You want to teach social and economic history, you want to teach history of the arts and sciences, history of religion, and so on. Absolutely. We should be as wide-ranging as possible in the range of historical subjects that we cover. So I absolutely agree with that. Having said that, you can't leave the political history out. I mean, I think it's very important that the mass murders and the crimes against humanity are absolutely in there. You know, this is one of the problems that actually we, in some ways, political history does dominate, but it tends to still be told as a kind of progressive story very often, where even at university level, the bad stuff that was involved in imperialism and colonialism and so on in a Western context often gets ignored. You know, so slavery and the elimination of indigenous peoples and all this sort of stuff gets kind of swept under the rug. And you know, just the role of war in human development and so on needs to be acknowledged. So I actually want the massacres and the crimes against humanity in there. I just don't want them to crowd out everything else. Now, in terms of cultural convergence, the kind of what's it all for question, so teaching the history of culture, and the larger question of whether we are moving towards some cultural convergence, and if so, is this a good thing? I think these are sort of meta-historical questions. They're not questions that historians as such can really answer. But there is a good book, I don't know if you know this one, Ernesto Di Martino, The End of the World. He's an Italian guy, and he has, what does he talk about? one of his arguments is the central problem of the world today is the need for a new cultural ethos. So as soon as you said that, you made me think of DiMartino, and looking at older stuff. I don't know if you know, like Arnold Toynbee's study of history, but Toynbee was kind of a cultural globalist. And in the mid-20th century, certainly, there was a very strong sense of, oh dear, we can now blow up the world. We better learn to share it. And I think we've got very complacent about that threat. It's tended to be replaced by, like, climate change is probably the #1 worry now, rather than nuclear destruction. But if anything, climate change only adds to the urgency that's imposed by, the nuclear issue, where for the first time, we have the power to send ourselves extinct. And we haven't really caught up with this. It's too much for us to process in a way, and I think I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, but you tend to retreat into your daily life and not sort of concern yourself too much with the existential threats that we all face as human beings, because we are in this really, just in the last 100 years or so, we've entered this really unprecedented phase of things, even since the mid-20th century, the invention of nuclear weapons. And yes, a cultural convergence where we learn to agree to disagree would be a wonderful thing, because at the moment there's still far too much sort of zero-sum thinking, where in order for me to be happy, you have to accept the way I see things. There's still far too much of a tendency to want to impose one's own point of view, and not enough willingness to live and let live, and so on. So I think I'm totally on board with cultural convergence. It's how we get there is another thing. But yes, it sounds like a great idea. Now I'm looking for a bit of paper where I wrote down your second question, and it's all flying around all over the place. What have I done with it? Sorry, can you remind me what the second question was?
About narrative in epistemological sense, as a form of organization and representation of historical knowledge specific for history. History is discipline.
Right. Yes. Okay. So I mean, I'm basically on board with Paul Ricoeur with all that stuff. That narrative is our basic form of understanding the world, and indeed. So yes, you were contrasting science and history here, and whether we need multiple narratives. That's right. Sorry. So I do think that all historical narratives are kind of talking about the same thing. So where you have different historical points of view, I mean, that can be an effect of the time frame or the kind of geographical area that's being covered. But if you've got two accounts that are really about the same event, then they can't just be alternative to one another. Somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong here. Now, we may not have the evidence, okay? And in which case, the only honest thing to do is say, well, we can't know because the relevant evidence that we need to decide this issue is missing. But assuming that we're really talking about the same thing and we have the evidence, then I'm not a relativist about this. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong here, ultimately. So that we are, when I was talking about the generation of a single kind of narrative of world history, that's come about because people have been able to agree that this happened rather than that. And it was significant for those reasons rather than these other reasons. So historians argue fiercely with one another, but they argue fiercely with one another because they think in the end that actually somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Not because there are multiple possible versions. You can have different points of view that are an effect of my time frame is longer than your time frame or something like that. But ultimately, history presupposes that we're talking about a single spatio-temporal series. And there's room for disagreement and contradiction, but only insofar as these have yet to be resolved. So I actually, I'm not sure that, while I think disagreement is very much part of getting to the truth, I think in the end, ideally, you get a narrative that everybody will find convincing. That's what you're aiming for. You want your historical narrative to persuade everybody. And now we may never get there. That's like the ideal situation, but that's kind of presupposed in historical knowledge, that you're trying to get people to think, no, this really was what happened. That's how it was. And that's what historians are trying to do. They're all trying to persuade you that their version is really, that's really the truth. And if this other guy disagrees, well, they're wrong, and they're wrong because X, Y, and Z. Now, you say that science, you made this contrast between science and history, where actually there's only one scientific theory versus multiple historical ones. I would argue, if I'm going to push back the other way a little bit, and if you look at somebody like Bruno Latour on the sort of production of scientific knowledge, well, Latour's whole thing is that as scientific knowledge is in formation, there are always a bunch of competing theories. So it's not different to history. It's the same thing. You've got a bunch of scientists running about, all convinced that their theory is the best one, and all trying to persuade one another because they're all convinced that they're right. And that is exactly like historians. And what they're trying to get to is, the scientific theory that everyone accepts. So Latour has that early book of his, what was it called? The first one, Science in Action, I think, and he talks about DNA and the history of DNA. And so everybody thinks that, everybody knows DNA is a thing, but they're just not quite sure, how it works or exactly what it's like. And so there's a bunch of different theories of DNA out there. And in the end, Watson and Crick produce a theory that everybody else is kind of forced to accept in the end, because everyone tries to criticize it, but Watson and Crick always have answers. So all the other theories have to be given up. And then we get to a fixed theory of DNA, but that theory was in fact the product of a lot of arguing. And so Latour makes a distinction between, science in formation and, as it were, settled science. I guess Thomas Kuhn's like normal science. And it's a bit like that with history. Historians have fierce arguments about how something happened, but then in the end, somebody wins. And we accept that version until there's a reason to kind of go back and revise possibly that version. Because you're never, even if you've got a kind of a settled theory of history, it's like in science, somebody can always come back later and maybe show you were wrong after all. All scientific and historical theories are always provisional in that sense. It could always turn out that you were wrong, in the same way that, with Newton, everybody thought for about 200 years Newton had solved it. Physics, done, and then along come Einstein and Planck and a bunch of other people, and no, not done, so, and that can happen in history too. So I actually think of history and science as being relevantly very similar in that way, except, yes, I mean, you're right, obviously history is narrative and science is sort of quantitative general laws and so on, but in terms of how the knowledge gets produced and the status of the knowledge, I think actually they're very similar, if that answers your question.
A little. I want to add a little comment. I have been thinking for some time that maybe Karl Popper's theory about evolutionary epistemology can be also useful for consideration of historical narrative, because Popper said that theories struggle each other for survival, and as a result, we get that theory that had that has the most explanatory effect, and maybe narrative should, if you can consider, we should consider narrative as such theories as that struggle among themselves.
So the guy who's good on this
model of historical reality.
I don't know if you know Frank Ankersmit. He's a Dutch philosopher of history, but he's very good on this, like the competing historical representations. So indeed, there's a sort of evolution here where the weak ones get weeded out, you know, and the strong theories are the theories that survive, and that's true in history and that's true in science. So yeah, I think you're right. Or Popper is right, you know. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. So you know, there is genuine progress in historical knowledge, just as there's genuine progress in scientific knowledge. We have better history than we had 100 years ago. You know, and it's not just we know more quantitatively, we also qualitatively have better history. You know, we have a more nuanced understanding of the past and all the different things that went on in the past. You know, we understand many more different sides of life in the past, you know. So historical knowledge, like scientific knowledge, I think is genuinely progressive or evolutionary, if you want to put it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dear Professor Paul Valliere, you can ask
Yes,
your
Luke, we haven't met, and it would be nice to meet. I've enjoyed hearing you in these seminars. Look forward to your book, and thank you for the presentation today. My question it goes somewhat along the same lines as Elena Michalova's in that it's prompted by concern for the continuing relevance of narratives. At the beginning of your presentation, you seem to be saying that the purpose of serious analytical, rigorous analytical particularizing history is to dispel metanarratives. But I don't see how what you described, particularly the way you just put it, a sort of historical science as progressing through the centuries and getting better and better with each passing century. I don't see how that isn't a meta-narrative. So that's my concern.
Okay.
Another way to get at this, a critical historian analyzes mythologies, meta-narratives to criticize them. I understand that. But I guess the question is that criticism motivated, dare I use the word inspired, by some aim of revising the narrative. In other words, making it a better narrative, rather than dispelling the narrative altogether. In the American case, for example, historians have a responsibility to critique the overly romantic view of our founding fathers. You alluded to that at the beginning of your talk. I completely accept that. The question is whether those historians are aiming to dispel the narrative altogether, in which case you can still ask whether there's another narrative that's going to be substituted for it. In other words, you see what I'm saying? How does one actually, or should one actually try to dispel all meta-narratives?
Okay, so thank you, Paul. The great questions, and yes, go to the sort of heart of the matter. So I do think on the just another meta-narrative question, it's a danger. But I do think when I'm talking about the distinction, say, between world history in the sense that historians, just looking at, I mean, I have a folder for works on that kind of theme, but when people like Stephen Wallach or whoever write a world history, you know, they're trying to observe the principles of the historical sciences and just sort of tell the stories of how different human communities developed and how in the end human history converged. And there's no sense there that that's any kind of necessary process, that it's obeying any kind of divine plan or what have you. It's a purely empirical well, this is what happened, and here are the reasons why, so far as we understand them, kind of approach. And so that's a very large scale narrative, or the largest possible scale narrative, without, I think, being a meta-narrative, because I think what's distinctive about meta-narratives, at least as Lyotard defined them, was that they're supposed to play a legitimatory role. So I think of meta-narrative as having some practical, generally kind of political function, whereas historiography in the analytical sense is really just trying to tell you, we think this is how it happened. Now, can you then take what historians do and kind of repurpose it in the public realm so that it functions as meta-narrative? Absolutely. That I don't think there's any way of preventing that. Nor do I necessarily think that that's a bad thing, because, you know, in public life and in politics, we have to have some sense of what the past was about, in relation to, you know, where we're headed in future. The political question is, what are we going to do? You know, the classic Leninist "what is to be done" question is really the heart of what politics is about. And the only way in which you can kind of figure out what we're going to do next is in relation to some account of what has happened. But this is why I want to distinguish, when we're talking about the role that historiography plays in public life, between the role of history and the role of social science. Because I think when it comes to things that point us to the future, we actually need the social scientists, the political scientists, the sociologists, and so on, who treat the past in a kind of generic way that's projectable, because they're dealing with the past in a way that treats it as about certain kinds of events. So this was Ina's question about basic categories of history. You know, what are the variables that are going to lead to political crisis? And we can look at the past and figure out some theories about that. And that's the thing that social scientists can do very effectively. What the historians can do, however, is not predict what's coming next, but the historians can, in a sense, delegitimate the nonsense. So when somebody comes out with some, you know, racist Slavophile theory about how Ukraine is really Russia, the historian can say, well, I'm sorry, no, it isn't, or no, it wasn't, you know, and the historian has this kind of negative sensorial role. But when it comes to the future, that's where the historian kind of cashes out. You know, they're not there to tell us what to do. They have a sort of quasi-judicial role almost in saying, no, it wasn't like that. Or yes, it was like that. So the historian can sort of affirm or deny narratives that politicians come out with about what the past was like. But that's where they stop. When it comes to using the past for what we should do going forward, then I think you need the kind of responsible social scientist who can tell us what are the sorts of conditions under which we're likely to experience wars or revolutions or other forms of political collapse that we need to guard against, for instance. So that's how I would, I guess, very broadly respond to those questions. But there is indeed always the danger, and you're totally right. You should always ask yourself whether you're not contributing to perpetuating something that you think you're arguing against. And I do actually ask myself this a lot, whether I'm not also part of the problem. So you're totally right to be skeptical and suspicious about this, you know. But I think the fact that when so take Hayden White's book on meta-history, where I think White went a bit too far, but you know, he argues that 19th century history was often written in terms of literary conventions. This is going back to what Ellen had to say about narratives a little bit. And White has this argument that, you know, history is quite like fiction in that respect, that there must be some kind of set of literary conventions that you're committed to. I think that's too strong, but I still think he was correct in thinking that in practice, 19th century historians often did write in sort of ways that conform to literary conventions that they were sort of unaware of. But as a result, I think they wrote worse history. But the thing is that we can now see that. We can see their assumptions. And if we can see the assumptions that other people are making like that, historians in the past are making, we can try and look at our own writing, our own narratives, and try and see what assumptions we're making. You know, you can scan your own thinking for your blind spots, and you should at least try, because you will have some. You will absolutely have some. You know, I'm very into psychoanalysis on this sort of stuff. You know, you're in the grip of all sorts of motivations and whatever that you're not maybe fully aware or fully conscious of, and you should absolutely be trying to be self-conscious about these sorts of things. So I'm totally on board with, I think, what is motivating your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Who wants to continue this discussion? No, thank you. Our communication today is very active, very interactive, very fruitful, my point of view. Thank you for your challenges from historical narratives.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor. Yes, I'm delighted, and I'm so sorry for being late. Again, it's just a time. I thought it was at 10, and my deepest apologies for keeping you all waiting. But yes, it's been lovely, and I look forward to talking more in future.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I hope we will continue our discussions. There are many challenges and for our mind, and maybe we can to review your book, and maybe we can to publish this review in our Ukrainian journals.
Oh, that would be lovely. Yeah, it's out in July. So if you want to order a copy for your university library or whatever, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
But yes, only if you like it. But if people want to talk about that some more, very happy to come back, and yeah, be lovely. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
My last
you.
questions, nobody else. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. We have to
Thank you.
we will continue our seminars, and soon I will invite you to the new
Oh, yes,
event.
please.
And maybe, dear Evgenia, can I introduce you as our future speaker? Can we?
Yes, sure, I will be happy to. Yeah, to give a talk next
Our
time.
next speaker,
Right.
Evgenia Ivanova, Ukraine and Great Britain now. She will talk about, but it will be secret now, or maybe no. We will.
Yeah,
It will maybe last seminar of this semester, and after a short break, we will continue our. Evgenia, maybe your topic, or we will.
yeah, I think it will be about the museums as a complex systems. So the more methodological topic, but anyway, I try to make it more interesting, and yeah, this is
But
my plan for next talk.
Look
member
forward to that.
of philosophical
Right.
community of Odessa, and represent the most one of the most methodological tradition of Odessa, theory of system. Yeah,
Yeah.
Avenir Uyomov, the great philosopher of Ukraine, I can tell us, but I suppose you will combine your practical orientation and some methodological ideas for this. Thank you so much.
Right.
See you soon, and have a nice day, peaceful,
Yeah,
fruitful.
bye. Thank you.
Bye. Olena, thank you so much for this, for organization. I was sure that it will be okay. It will be okay. Any doubts that our seminar be very
Я вже почала трошки хвилюватися, якщо чесно, на початку.
А тут хтось також щось сплутав, є люди, які от зараз приходять, але добре, я тут зупиняю запис.